The Atlanta Police Department seeks to turn 300 acres of forest into a tactical training compound featuring a mock city. This project was announced to the shock of community members who had been given no opportunity to weigh in on the proposal. Entrenchment Creek is an existing public park adjacent to the prison farm. DeKalb County seeks to swap this land with Black Hill Studios, now rebranded as Shadowbox Studios, a major film production company. Blackhall wants to clear-cut 170 acres of forest to develop an airport and erect the largest sound stage in America. This project would cement Atlanta as the new Hollywood, making the cost of this city outrageous. The forest in southeast Atlanta is home to wetlands that filter rainwater and prevent flooding. It is also one of the last breeding grounds for many amphibians in this region, as well as an important migration site for wading birds. The history of this particular land is deeply scarred. In the 1800s, shortly after the land was stolen from Muskogee Creek peoples, it was used as a plantation. In the early 1900s, a prison farm was opened where inmates were forced to perform unpaid agricultural labor, marking the rebranding of slavery into for-profit prison labor. The Atlanta Police Department currently uses this hallowed ground as a firing range. This forest is at risk of destruction as the police and Hollywood make plans to pave over Atlanta's largest remaining green space. In this episode, we're joined by two activists who work to defend this forest. If you enjoy this conversation and want to hear more, check out the Defend the Atlanta Forest for tour information. They should be in Southeast speaking at the time of this release. Hey y'all, thanks for joining us. I know you're busy, and we're going to talk about why you're so busy in a moment, but I really appreciate you guys carving some time out today. For folks not familiar with the work you're doing with the Atlanta Forest and defending it, could you explain a little bit of what's going on in Atlanta and why it's so important? I'll kick it over to you, Speckle.
Yeah, so the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the Atlanta Police Department, is attempting to build a cop city in the middle of Wolani Forest, the South River Forest in South Atlanta. So for the past year and a half, people have been fighting against this and struggling against it underneath a movement called Defend the Atlanta Forest. People are targeting the contractors, living in the woods, doing call-ins, and a multiplicity of tactics to be able to fight against this. And there's a welcoming for different types of people and for different tactics to be used within this as well. Political tactics, cultural ones, like having events in the woods and having things to bring people there. Yeah, an array of different tactics that are direct and symbolic, political, cultural, institutional, and autonomous. Yeah, it's like an amalgamation of things, and there's so many moving parts a part of the movement, but everyone who is a part of it is working to ensure that Cop City will never be built.
I think people can gather why this idea of building a cop city in the forest is a bad thing. Now, what's particularly important about this forest in Atlanta?
We like to flex that it's the largest continuous urban forest in the country, which is a big deal to have so much forested space in the middle of a pretty big city. So in some ways it's a big deal because this forest is so big and because Atlanta is a city that is very forested. It's almost half covered in tree canopy, so people call it a city in a forest, but it's also the city that is being deforested at the fastest rate in the US. This is especially relevant in the context of migration related to climate change, amongst other reasons that people would be migrating. But within the US, a lot of people are probably going to be migrating away from coastal cities, especially on the Atlantic coast where the sea level rises are going to be more and more devastating to those places. And so for a city to be more resilient by having so much forest is a really big deal in all of that context. But also in some ways, it's just any space that is under threat is something that we think is worth fighting for. And this is relevant because this forest is relatively young. It's it's a very scarred place. If people have learned anything about this movement, you might have heard that there was a prison farm on the land before it started becoming forest. And then before that, of course, before it was a prison farm, it was just a plantation where enslaved people were forced to work the land. And then before that, it was lived in by Muskogee people who were violently forced off of the land. And so there's these cyclical forms of violence and forced labor happening on this land that are threatened to continue, specifically with the Cop City project. And so this movement seeks to end those cycles of violence, both within our communities and on the land, so that we can, together with the land and as human communities, be healing from all of these forms of violence together.
Mm.
I mean, I think Atlanta is actually the most rural city in the country, if I recall correctly, in terms of like human density, which is I think really interesting and points to the fact that Atlanta probably offers some really good examples of what a more sustainable urban space could look like, and the idea of basically deconstructing that just seems, given the fact that it is 2022 and climate change is just just look at the news in the last 2 weeks and what's happened to like just in the United States, and you want to remove that. Just seems like total, like it seems like a suicide attempt basically by the people that run the economy.
Yeah, and during the summer, the heat here got up to 107, like in the end of May, which is really, really high for Atlanta. Typically August is the hottest month here, and so that was really like shocking. But also in the forest, it's about like 10 to 15 degrees cooler than when you're in the parking lot and when you're on the paved bike trail to get into the forest as well. So there's really like stark differences that you can feel when you're actually there too. And if the Wani forest is cut down, it will increase flooding that happens here. And during the summers, we especially have downpour where the roads are kind of flooding and people are hydroplaning a lot. So that is like a big worry as well. And yeah, it does feel like it will destroy the city even faster, which is one of the reasons why they're, doing this. It's a part of gentrification to bring more people in, like with Hollywood and with Black Hall Studios, which is the movie production company that is doing the land swap, where they want to swap the Entrenchment Creek Park, which is the public park of the Ohlone Forest. They want to build it into the largest movie sound studio in the Western world. Also, the Cop City project is coming after the 2020 uprising, where Atlanta really showed out for a long time. Richard Brooks was killed here at a Wendy's in South Atlanta, and that was in June of 2020. And after that, the uprising continued, of course, and the police weren't able to control the crowds that were happening here. Atlanta had like the highest rate of cops leaving the force, and also one of the highest increases in police budgets after the uprising as well too. So the city of Atlanta and the Atlanta Police Foundation is wanting to build Cop City to train in urban warfare against protesters and to continue the trend of counterinsurgency as well.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of layers to this that each of these pieces separately would be terrible, but together creates this uniquely catastrophic domino effect. If the forest is cleared, all these different things happen. Never mind just the ecological impacts, but the capacity for the state to retaliate and to refine their methodologies for challenging or dealing with like insurgencies and things like that. That's why this is so important, and why there's been a lot of interest in what you guys are doing. And One of the things that I've been thinking about is that last spring, I feel like there's a lot of activity going on in terms of like social media presence and things like that with what you're doing. Now, first, I'm curious how that impacted the organizing and the effectiveness and even the response by the state with what you were doing, and kind of how maybe things have, as it's waned a bit, how that's impacted, again, those same things.
It was interesting when there was like a week or two where suddenly defend the Atlanta Forest was semi trending for a minute on like Twitter and Instagram. I think that's all really good. Really, the more word about this movement that can get out, the better. I think, especially in the context of these two projects we've talked about, the police training facility that the movement calls Cop City, and the Hollywood studios that the movement calls Hollywood Dystopia. These are projects these are projects that were supposed to be secret. They were supposed to be deals made between politicians and corporate entities that normal people weren't supposed to know about. And so part of the strength of this movement is just letting people know of these things that were supposed to just slip by us all. And that's really powerful because any scandal related to those projects harms the potential of them being built. But it also means, in an immediate sense, that a lot of money was donated, which is helpful for people to just make certain things happen. But that's one little piece. I think the most useful thing of the word getting out over the internet and other forms of media is just people who might be interested in supporting the movement, whether that's by making things happen, like solidarity actions or fundraisers or info sessions in their local places, or actually coming to Atlanta and supporting the camps that exist in the forest, which is a big part of the strategy to keep these things from being built, is just maintaining a constant presence in the forest. And the more people who are staying there, just the more robust the communal infrastructure of life in the forest can be, and the harder it would be for people to be kicked out of the forest.
Yeah, I think that speaks to just a general understanding of how, collectively we're so much more powerful than just a handful of us trying to work together. And I think for a lot of people, even, we talk about these types of projects as being primarily like, anarchist, communist, whatever, wherever you fall kind of on the left spectrum. But in reality, like this impacts everyone across the spectrum, and I think it's very approachable for folks that are not on the left to say there are things here that I am concerned about. From a libertarian right perspective, there's very good reason to be suspicious of the cops building a new facility, and I think talking about these things with as many people as possible and exposing them to what's going on can be really helpful, and not just in a sense of radicalizing them, but also in just saying, hey, we have common ground. We are not each other's enemy. There's other stuff going on that's more important than just our politics, and we need to support each other in very broad-based actions like stopping cops from building new facilities and protecting the ecosystem that keeps us alive. That's important work. One of the things you guys are doing right now, I know you're traveling right now, is talking to folks and traveling and speaking about what's going on in Atlanta. So first, I want to ask kind of what was the thing that made you think, what, I need to go out. We need to go talk to people in their locations and get them aware of what's going on. So what was that impetus to start driving this idea?
There's a strong history of radical groups traveling around the country and traveling internationally to connect with other groups and other people who are experiencing similar struggles or have similar political ideologies as them. It's important to have a strong network of connections when fighting against racial capitalism and structures of oppression, because it can't be done with a small group. It's a conjunction of forces. That was really important when thinking about ways to broaden the movement. Also, what's happening in Atlanta isn't just a local struggle. Yes, it's happening here in the Wani Forest and is within the specific context of that forest and post uprising. But this is gonna, if this facility gets built, which it's not going to, it will impact everyone that lives in the United States. They are proposing to use 400 acres of land, which is like a huge training facility, and presumably this facility will be open to other police departments across the country as well. And the Atlanta Police Department already works with the Israeli Defense Forces, a part of the Gilly program, which is funded by Georgia State University and the other funders of the Atlanta Police Foundation as well. That's how the Atlanta Police Department was able to learn tactics of kettling during the uprising. So there is already an international connection of different counter revolutionary forces and forces that perpetuate and hold capitalism working together, and that bond will be strengthened through Cop City if it is built. And so, kind of sharing that around the country with people that this is something that impacts them as well, and that there are also other struggles that are happening where they are living that is connected to this as well, and sharing tactics and lessons and structures of the movement so far to be able to connect with people and to grow.
When you think about what's happening, the repercussions are significant, and I don't think they can really be understated. And as much as we can, connect on our phones, it still is a far second to in person and having those experiences and having those conversations in a way that traditional media or social media isn't fully able to recreate, and that nuance that we can have in verbal conversations or just face-to-face conversations. We can't understate the value of that. Has this been as successful as you had hoped in terms of like making these connections across the country?
It's been really powerful. And like you're saying, compared to being on your phone or reading something, it just really hits different when you're in a space with people who live in the same place as you, and you get to interact with someone more directly, maybe ask questions or chit chat after a presentation. That's been really apparent with the feedback that we get from people after these talks, that a lot of people will say that they've been aware of the movement in Atlanta, but it never like felt so directly connected to them until being at one of these talks and really feeling either a sort of direct connection, and this is something that I want to support, or feeling, I guess, and or feeling like there's things about this movement that are very inspiring or opening up new ways of thinking about things and bringing people new energy or new creativity for their own projects and struggles locally, which I think, as much as it's important for the movement in Atlanta, having these strengthened relationships in many places, it also, that energy moves both ways, both in forms of being able to tangibly support each other's struggles, but also to learn lessons and ideas from each other, because so much of our power as people resisting against big structures of domination is that there's so many of us and we have so much creativity. And when more of us are experimenting and learning and sharing our experiences and ideas with each other, it just opens up more and more room for more experimentation so that we can hone our efforts and really try to actually make the more beautiful, freer worlds that we're trying to make more effectively.
I always think about, you don't want to recreate the wheel, but conversely, there's power in multiplicity. And how do you balance those two things of trying to create something and open it up to other people without, I guess, just trying to balance the need to create redundancies and diversity and resilience through localized action without overdoing that. And I think that face-to-face piece of it is really important because you understand where people stand and kind of what their goals and roles are in that process of creating that diversity in that fabric. Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Poor Proles Almanac. This is Andy, reminding you that if you're looking for more content outside of the scope of the podcast, or sources, recommended readings, or ways to support us, you can find that at poorproles.com. Further, we've expanded our delivery into video content on our YouTube channel, where we're able to show step-by-step how to do many of the processes that we talk about within the podcast. We have also started a Twitch channel where we platform various folks on skills from DIY mushroom production to the various methods to keep land out of the hands of developers. Again, all this can be found at poorproles.com, and we look forward to seeing you over there. With everything going on, has your goal for building networks and all the things you guys are doing right now, has that changed at all with kind of the diversity of tactics that the state is using to try to basically get what they want?
I think it remains to be seen what will be thrown at this movement in terms of repression. What has come down is mostly what the police are physically able to do and not a whole lot else. They've not very effectively wielded courts against the movement. They haven't pressed really scary charges, and actually a lot of the charges that they press end up getting dropped because they're just kind of bullshit charges a lot of the time whenever they can grab someone they think is related to the movement. But we can't know what's going on in terms of surveillance. We can't know what's going on in terms of attempts to discredit or to create challenges for the movement, like COINTELPRO style of seeding conflicts or whatever. All we can really do is deal with things as they come up, and I hope that people have great security practices so that people who need to protect their identities and information about their lives from the state are doing that effectively. And I think we'll probably see more repression, and maybe we'll even see, in the same way that this movement is somewhat innovative, perhaps we'll see some innovations from the state and how they seek to repress movements for liberation.
Yeah.
I hope everyone's taking notes so that everyone will be learning from how this goes.
Mhm. Yeah, we also have the Atlanta Solidarity Network here that supports political prisoners and supports them through the entire process, including they're incarcerated as long as they don't snitch. But yeah, the network is really, really strong and really built up during the uprising. The jail support within that network is really strong, and there's a really heavy culture here of supporting people who are arrested and being there for them. And yeah, the network has lawyers. It's something that makes participating within this movement and within other movements in Atlanta feel safer in a way by having a team of people, an array of people working with and working for, specifically for people who are arrested for political charges.
Yeah, that infrastructure can't be understated. It's so both boring and necessary, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's something we need. And to get back to the context point where they had talked about the evolution of the state, one of the things I think folks sometimes forget when we get into resistance is that we're basically in an arms race in some ways, in the sense that the state will try to evolve faster than us and learn very quickly what they can to continue to contain any type of resistance that exists. So that means what works today may not work tomorrow, and paying attention to that is really important. I think sometimes we do, or at least people getting into direct action will look at historical examples of what we should do, and there's a time and place for that, but also to be very aware of what's happening and to listen to people that are on the ground and have experienced these things, who can very quickly bring people up to speed on what is working, what isn't working. So building that community, again, it always comes back to having that community and that infrastructure in place to support one another and being successful. Now, with everything going on, how do things stand right now in terms of whether or not things feel like they're moving in the right direction? It kind of sounds like that might be the case.
In terms of the Cop City project, they really struggle to get any work done, and they're so far behind schedule. They're supposed to start work on May 3rd of this year, and as we're interviewing, it's late September, and they've hardly gotten anything done, and they can't progress on their timeline of these different phases of destruction of the forest and then construction, because they haven't managed to rid the forest of beautiful people being there to prevent the construction and destruction from happening. I find it hard to imagine how they're going to get any more work done other than tiny little increments anytime soon. There would have to be some pretty drastic change of the dynamics of the struggle. So there's a lot of people who feel pretty confident in how things are going on the ground in terms of defense, but also as the movement grows, its ability to go on the offensive is also growing. This is opening up more potentials for both Cop City and Hollywood Dystopia to be halted because they're just financially unreasonable projects to continue to pursue because they just get so darn expensive. And
So, go ahead.
well, so with the Hollywood Dystopia project, there's this land swap that Speckle mentioned that went through, and so there's this ultra wealthy Hollywood investor guy who has claimed ownership over what was Entrenchment Creek Park to the point of actually closing it and barricading it. Those barricades were opened and the park was renamed Weelaunee People's Park. Weelaunee is a name that comes from our Muskogee friends, a name for what settlers named the South River that's nearby. So Weelaunee People's Park is still a park open for anyone to come, and many people are still enjoying the park as ever. And anytime that there's an effort to close the park or to destroy something in the park, it's met with pretty fierce resistance on the ground, which maybe is exemplified by a relatively new installation art piece in the parking lot, which is the burnt out carcass of Ryan Millsap's tow truck. Ryan Millsap is the investor guy who thinks that he owns the park.
That's awesome.
There's now plants growing out of the truck from beneath it, and it's becoming a permanent fixture of the People's Park. So I think this speaks to some of the potential to continue, keeping this land safe from these forces of destruction for probably a really long time. And we'll see, it'll be, ongoing.
Do you feel like you're getting positive reception from like the general residents of Atlanta? And if you are, is that something that's like grown, or do you feel like it's been pretty stable and static in that support?
I feel like it's something that's grown, especially with the last week of action, the fourth week of action that was in the last week of July. One of the main goals of that was to increase local engagement. During the weeks of actions, there's an array of different self-organized cultural events that happen. Like there were AA meetings, there were reading groups, and there was also a 3-day music festival that happened in the woods as well that had an array of different Atlanta artists from punk bands to indie bands to solo singers, DJs, etc., to really widen the base of people who come to the woods and are experiencing the woods. And so, definitely with there being a focus on cultural events happening and people putting energy into that and bringing people into the woods and also people zine tabling at different events across the city as well has increased local engagement. There's yard signs that get printed that have Defend the Atlanta Forest and that website on one side and Stop Cop City and the Stop Cop City website on the other side that you can see around the city driving from different neighborhoods.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful sight to see. You can also see them in different businesses around Atlanta as well too. There's a really wide support from people that live in the city that are against Cop City and Hollywood Dystopia being built because it directly impacts all of us that live here. And most people love trees and love to be able to go to a park and walk around and ride their bike and to have free open spaces where they're not policed.
Absolutely. For folks that are listening, you've been doing this for a while now. What do you recommend people do? Not necessarily just to support what you're doing, but much like the sessions you've been doing around the country, that people can take as lived experiences that you've had back to the organizing that they're doing at home.
I think it's very valuable to participate in this movement and flow with the momentum that this movement has, and as much as possible learn as directly as possible the lessons that can be learned from this movement. So coming to the forest and staying there to help run life in the forest is really valuable. Holding events in your local places, you could hold also these info sessions. It doesn't have to be someone from Atlanta who's speaking, and also holding solidarity events. Some places have offices of the same contractors who are involved in the Cop City or the Hollywood Dystopia project. And so some people have gone and done protests outside of offices or work sites. Sometimes people do things that are a little spicier than protests, and sometimes people will just do call-in campaigns and things like that. That's all really valuable if people want to find out more about who is being contracted to destroy the Woolani Forest. There's a website called stopreedsyoung.com where you can find out about all these different contractors involved and think about how, if you want to be part of letting them know how you feel about their involvement in these projects, that sort of a thing. But I also think it's really valuable to learn from the ways this movement is structured, or in some ways is unstructured. We call it a movement because there is no one organization or coalition or campaign that can really sum up the movement. And actually, many participants in the movement aren't even a part of any formal organization or anything like that. And so it creates more of a maybe a diverse ecosystem with many niches when people aren't trying to impose a structure or a particular vision or ideology over how some kind of struggle is going on, and instead remaining open to all of the different possibilities that can come from different people and groups of people bringing their ideas into the fold. That can be really valuable, and I think that's one of the big takeaways that people have been having from these talks that folks are doing about the movement is that I don't have to build power within an organization. I don't have to run a formal campaign. I don't have to be determining how anything goes in particular. This is especially hard for people who consider themselves community organizers or leaders within an activist organization or something to consider that there might be a whole nebulous thing going on that you may or may not agree with what many of the people are doing. And I think it's really powerful in the context of being after the George Floyd uprisings, where much of what happened that showed so much potential and created so much momentary freedom for a lot of people was very emergent. It wasn't no one planned that. It just kind of happened that way because people were moving with each other, and so we can take inspiration from that and not stifle our movements for liberation by trying to force our vision over them and let things unfold as they will.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. It also makes it incredibly hard for the state to deal with it because the state is designed to deal with other institutions with figureheads and things like that. When you offer the opposite, that it's like amorphous, there's nothing to grab for them, and it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge it. And I think that's part of probably why you've been so successful.
We saw what they did with the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement and the Black Liberation Army and so on. We don't have to replicate, structured organizations where there's people in formal positions and their government names out there and they're speaking as representatives and so on. It can be something a lot more confusing for the state and maybe for us as well, but that can also be exciting and have a lot of potential.
Yeah, it definitely, in my opinion, checks a lot of the capacity for the state to infiltrate and basically convert figureheads into, liberal pieces that they can manipulate through. Kind of what we've seen with like Black Lives Matter and in many cases. That can be really dangerous in itself. So I think despite the fact that it can be challenging to work in that kind of environment, it does offer a number of benefits.
Yeah, it's a way of being 5 or 10 steps ahead of the state and also protecting the movement and the people within that movement as well.
Yeah. Anything else you would like to plug, suggest, or recommend for folks that want to learn more or get more involved?
Kind of expanding on what Context said, if people want to host info nights in their cities or create action groups to show solidarity, they can also go to defendingatlantaforest.org/library, and on that page there are posters and zines and info sheets that people can print out from wherever they are and distribute them at any info nights or at any shows or events that they're going to, and table and talk to people about the Defend the Atlanta Forest movement and also things that are going on locally for them as well. And the general contractor for the Cop City project right now is Brassville and Gorey, also Atlas Technical Consultants and Long Engineering. So earlier Context was talking about like a tactic that people could use is learning more about these 3 companies, where they live, and all of that information is on stopreadsyoung.com.
Awesome. Speckle Context. This has been a really great, inspiring conversation, and I look forward to seeing the work you guys keep doing, and I'm sure we'll touch base again.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.